Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. Today we're going to take a little tour through the garden. It's going to be the July garden tour. Now, I'm kind of calling this the lazy gardener's garden tour. It's a little bit of a misnomer because honestly, I don't want to disparage myself by saying that I've been lazy in the garden. The reality is that I have been very busy in life. But, kind of poke fun at myself a little bit and say that I've been a lazy gardener this year. This garden is wild and out of control and doing its own thing, and probably the biggest thing to get out of this garden tour today, we have some stuff in the garden that is doing really well and I'm really excited to show you. But that's happening kind of despite my care in the garden this year. There's been a lot going on this summer, and despite the fact that I have really neglected my garden this summer, it's still producing really well for me, and there's a lot that I'm still really looking forward to. That being said, there are also some failures in the garden, which I'll show you those today too. So starting over here in the side yard garden, you can see that my trellises are starting to fill out fairly well. Some of these squashes are wandering as well. They're not completely behaving and going up the trellis, but you can see we are starting to get some nice squash fruits here. And overall, I'm happy with how this trellis is shaping up. And honestly, even this little bit of wandering squash, this is still beautiful to me, so this doesn't really bother me. So last year we put this garden in from scratch. I grew stuff on these trellises the first time, and honestly, the trellises over in this part of the garden were a little disappointing last year. I didn't really have very good success getting plants to grow on these trellises and make these beautiful arches. And we're definitely, while it's not perfect this year, it's definitely going a lot better, and I'm really happy with how it's shaping up. Now, you will notice here, I have some creatures trying their best to sabotage me. These are squash beetle larvae. So probably, I think what I'm going to do later today is come out here with a bucket of soapy water and try to knock all these little guys into the soapy water. These, as you can see, they're clearly damaging my squash, and so I don't want to allow those to really spread and take hold. Despite that though, the squash is really doing well. And you can see over here, this pumpkin that's climbing up this trellis actually originates way back over there in the garlic patch. So this is definitely a wandering squash this year. It made its way over to this trellis, so I kind of gave it a little bit of a boost, and I'm allowing it to climb the side of the trellis, which actually works out well because I don't think that any of the plants, actually no, I take that back. There is a little squash here. Most of the plants that I planted in here with the strawberries didn't end up making it. They mostly got eaten by slugs when they were tiny seedlings, aside from this little survivor. So this sugar pie pumpkin made its way over here, and I decided to let that climb. Additionally, this butternut squash, this is an offshoot of a plant planted over here. It's coming up to climb too. So we're just going to let all that happen and see how it goes. So this looks like it's shaping up to be the first year that I'm going to have any kind of success with winter squash and pumpkins. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how they do. So behind the trellis in this bed here, you can see this is a hodgepodge, and this is exactly what I'm talking about when I'm saying it's a little bit of a lazy gardening year. You can see this has not been well maintained. This is officially the sweet potato bed, and you can see I have sweet potatoes basically mulching this entire bed, spreading out. I have a few tomatoes in here too. This is a black from Tula tomato. I don't really have it well supported. It's just in a tomato cage. You can see some of the branches are bending down a little bit. Despite that, it's getting a few tomatoes, and I'm excited to try that. This is a new variety for me this year. And so we'll walk around here. Got some calendula. This has given me a big harvest already from this plant here. Got some wild nasturtiums on the edges. And here is a Roma tomato that has decided to collapse and take its stake with it. So we're just going to let this be and hopefully still get a good harvest from this. So this bed is definitely wild and crazy, but I actually think that the craziness is really beautiful. I'm just hoping that it doesn't negatively impact any of the harvest from this bed, but aesthetically, I actually kind of like a wild garden, which you'll definitely see is true as we go through the rest of the garden, and you can see all different types of wildness all over. So I'm really liking these zinnias here mixed in. I think they're really pretty. And even the squash flowers, those big bold flowers, those are really beautiful in this garden too. Now over here, I have a couple pots. You can see these tomatoes these have grown impressively. I actually don't know if those were even here on the last garden tour. In my area, tomatoes tend to yield really well for, probably the second half of July into August, sometimes into early September. But then at some point they usually get sick with disease. And then that really slows down their yield. I don't usually get a lot of fresh tomatoes right up until frost. So what I like to do sometimes is a second planting of tomatoes. Now, what I can do to kind of cheat the system a little bit, rather than starting a second round of tomato seeds, is I can do what I did here, where I clip some suckers off of some established tomato plants and then I root them to create new plants. Rooting suckers from established plants is a lot quicker and it's a lot less work for me. So here I have a Ukrainian purple tomato and here is a Wisconsin 55. In this pot here I have a couple watermelon plants. I'm not sure if we'll have time to get watermelons from these before frost or not because they are a large fruited variety, but we'll see what happens. Back here, you'll see the first of many failures that I referenced. These plants are actually beautiful in a kind of ghostly sort of way, I guess. So this section of Brassicas in this bed is the perfect illustration of why I really like to grow my Brassicas under cover and under netting. This is what happens to them when I don't. You can see all these leaves. They're basically just turned to lace. As I said, they're sort of beautiful, but when you're going for a harvest, this is not really the outcome that you want. So I basically over here, I wasn't planning to grow brassicas here. What happened was that I had extra seedlings and I wasn't really sure what to do with the space. So I was like, okay, well, that's a perfect match. We'll take these extra seedlings and this extra space and let them grow together and see what happens. Obviously, I did not cover them and the cabbage worms, invaded this bed. So in here, I had broccoli, I had kale, I had cabbage. You can see those pests are equal opportunity. They have taken a significant harvest out of all of these plants. So I think at this point it's unlikely that these will come back. So I will probably end up pulling these out and replacing them maybe with a second sowing or third or fourth, whatever sowing I'm up to now, of lettuce. Now in this half of the bed, it's a little bit of a happier story. Not really amazing, but better. I have some tomatoes over here. Let's walk around to the side here. This tomato in particular, this is Aroma, and you can see, I don't know how much you can see through the leaves, but this tomato plant is loaded down with fruit, so we should get some good tomatoes there. On this trellis here, I have mini pumpkins, and up you can see there's an actual little pumpkin there. And I don't know if you can really see it, there's a second mini pumpkin there. So many of these plants were also attacked by slugs when I first planted them, and some of them didn't survive. Others, limped along and survived but didn't really thrive. This one, of course, looks beautiful. So I have a mix of orange mini pumpkins and white mini pumpkins, which I think, if they're actually able to recover and cover this whole trellis, I think that'll be really beautiful, and that'll give us some nice little mini pumpkins for fall. Over here, you can see that my garlic needs to be harvested. It's honestly probably past time to harvest. I did harvest the elephant garlic from this part of the bed here. This is my German white garlic, and this needs to come out immediately. Ideally, I actually probably should have harvested it a few days ago. The reason why I haven't yet is because we did get some significant rain for a couple days in a row. Garlic tends to store better if you harvest it when it hasn't rained for a few days. So I wanted to give it a couple days to dry out before harvesting it, but at this point, I think I'm going to have to take a chance, harvest it. I'm not sure if I'll have time today. I'll probably try to harvest this tomorrow. And then hopefully it's been dry enough, long enough that it'll still cure and still store really well. And then once the garlic is out, I'm going to have to figure out what to plant in this bed here. So I'm open to suggestions for that. So here is the large wandering sugar pie pumpkin that I mentioned. You can see it makes its way along the strawberry patch, all the way back there and up the trellis that we talked about. So strawberries, they look nice and healthy. They're done yielding for the year, so those will just sit here until next year. I am going to pull out some runners. You can see they're starting to make runners. I'm going to pull out some runners and use them in some other places in my yard. Here's another arm of the squash. So let's carefully step over this pumpkin here. Here you can see my orange corner datura pepper is still over here. This is the one that I'm isolating over here so that I can prevent cross-pollination and save some seeds from this. This is a fairly rare and hard to find variety, so assuming that I like the peppers, I like the flavor and the yield, then I do want to save seeds from this. And over here, I just want to show you my little mini sugar pie pumpkin. I'm really excited about that guy. Unfortunately, this has grown through the fence and it's in my chicken yard. When my chickens free range, this is the area that they hang out in. So this is going to be vulnerable to chicken attack. So we'll see how long it survives. I intentionally planted that pumpkin on the corner of the bed, knowing that it would sprawl and wander a little bit. And I was planning to let it kind of wander along the paths. I didn't realize it was going to sprawl quite as much as it has. But, you know, it's really, I'm fine if it takes up some of my pathway space as long as I can still get by. It did decide to go a little rogue and go into the chicken yard too. So hopefully we're actually able to harvest that pumpkin. We'll see what happens. Now across the walkway here, I've got my tomatoes. These are overall doing well. We haven't really, the only tomatoes I've harvested from this patch so far have been some cherry tomatoes from this mystery plant. You can see back there, there's a blush. That's going to be the first black tomato of the season. I can't wait to harvest that. Now, this tomato here is a bit of a mystery. If you've been following along with me at all this year, then you've heard the saga of my Cherokee Purple woes this year. Cherokee Purple is my favorite slicer tomato. So delicious. It's generally really reliable for me. It yields really well for an heirloom for me. So, you know, all around, it's really just my favorite large tomato. This year, you know, I start the majority of my tomatoes from seed. My Cherokee Purple seeds, for some reason, did not germinate this year. So what I decided to do was purchase some Cherokee Purple transplants at a local nursery. So I tried out a new nursery. It was a great nursery. I'm thinking it probably wasn't the nursery's fault what happened. I'm guessing there were probably some mislabeled seeds. But what happened, I purchased 2 supposed Cherokee Purple starts and ended up with this cherry tomato instead. One of the reasons that I think it was mislabeled seeds is that I purchased 2 and they're both the same. So you can see this is clearly not a Cherokee Purple. I'm actually not incredibly thrilled with it. You know, it's producing fairly well. The tomatoes taste good, but I already have lots of cherry tomatoes and I already have lots that I actually prefer the flavor of those varieties. And as you can see, this plant is starting to show some signs of disease. I would say that this is the most disease-riddled tomato variety in my garden. You can see these other tomatoes over here still look great, where this one is definitely showing signs of disease. So, well, we'll take the tomatoes that we get out of it and, you know, hope for the best otherwise. So in here I've also got some melons growing along the fence here. These don't seem to be, they look fine. They're not really thriving, so I'm hoping that they'll catch up as the season goes on. You can see I've got some basil here. Over on this side of the trellis, I originally planted melons here too. They were all eaten by slugs, so I've replanted with pole beans, which are, you know, just starting to take off. So hopefully it'll be a little while before we get beans from these, although I do see the very beginnings of flower buds in here. So hopefully it won't be too long till we get beans from this side of the trellis. I'm actually really fine waiting for a while to get beans from this because I have lots of other beans growing in my garden. And this will actually extend my green bean harvest later into the year. So even though my original plan was to grow melons here and it would have been nice to harvest those, it's also nice to extend the green bean harvest a little bit longer. So I think that's everything that I really want to show you in this side yard garden. We're going to head over to the main garden and I'll show you what's going on over there. So as we approach the main garden, you can see that it is lush and beautiful and also a little bit unruly. So let's head on in. So probably the first thing you notice is the arch trellises here. This first one has cucumbers on it. On this side of the trellis, I have primarily homemade pickles cucumbers, which are a classic green pickling cucumber. You can see we've got lots of little cucumbers here. I've actually already harvested quite a few of these green pickling cucumbers. They've been delicious and sweet. We've really been enjoying them. So now that the plants are really starting to take off, we haven't actually made any pickles yet. We've just been, eating them fresh. But now that the plants are really starting to take off, I'm thinking it won't be too long before we are getting enough cucumbers at once that we can make some delicious refrigerator pickles. While I do make and can pickles sometimes too, I really prefer refrigerator pickles. They stay a lot crispier and they're, it's less work, which is always a bonus. And I find that if you keep them in the fridge, which, you need to because they're not preserved. So stored in the fridge, they actually last quite a long time. On this side of the trellis here, this is supposed to be all silver slicer cucumbers. And down here, you can see I've got my first silver slicer, actually almost ready. This plant here is the only one that survived the initial slug attacks. So I did replant, and I have lots of little baby cucumber seedlings. So these are behind, but they will catch up. And if all goes well, it really should be the same concept that we were talking about with the green beans in the other part of the garden. These should extend my cucumber harvest, hopefully all the way up till frost. Cucumbers tend to die out before the end of the season. A lot of times when it gets really hot, cucumbers like heat, but when it gets really hot for an extended period of time, sometimes they turn bitter and stop producing as well. So having a second harvest of cucumbers or a second sowing of cucumbers to produce a second harvest is a great way to extend the cucumber season. Now, let's talk about this crazy pumpkin here. I'm sure you've seen this in recent videos. This pumpkin, this is its official home. This is where it's supposed to live, sprawling on the ground in front of my tomato plants. And it has done that quite well. It's sprawled all the way across that walkway there, gone up the back fence, over the fence into my raspberry patch on the other side. Here you can see it's climbed the tomato trellis. Here it's sprawled into this walkway and climbed my cucumber trellis. And, it's trying to climb this way as well, up to the bean trellis. It really would like to take over the world. So far, despite all this growth, I haven't seen any sign of actual pumpkins yet. It's had lots of male flowers, but I'm assuming that with a plant this big and healthy and happy, it's got to produce a couple pumpkins for us, so we'll see as the season goes on. Now, these trellises here, as you can see, are covered with pole beans in their full glory. We have just started harvesting pole beans. We haven't had a real lot yet. You can see we are getting beans here and there. This is the rattlesnake bean. You can see that it's green with purple streaks. This is one of my favorite beans. This side of the trellis behind me is a little bit ahead of all my other green beans because I actually took a little bit of a risk and I planted this side of the trellis before our official last frost date had passed. It was a few weeks before our estimated last frost, and I didn't think we were going to get any more frost, so I took a risk and planted some beans, knowing full well that if we did get an unexpected frost, we would lose them, and I was okay with that. It paid off because we did not, in fact, get a frost. So now we're getting beans from this side of the trellis. On this side, I have Vortex green beans, which is my other favorite green bean. These are kind of a classic round green bean. Very delicious. This bean is really prolific. You can see it's really just getting started. I mean, it's got lots of flowers and tiny little beans. So these are the beginning. And soon we'll have an abundant harvest of beans here. This back side of the trellis here, or this back trellis, this side has rattlesnake beans, which these actually need to be harvested. These are on the edge of being too ripe, but you can see this is a really good example. It's a beautiful green bean with purple streaks. Those are rattlesnakes. We really enjoy those. On this side of the trellis here, got these beautiful, this is purple potted pole, these beautiful deep purple beans. I really enjoy these for a little bit of color contrast. Of course, the downside of purple beans is that they do turn green when they're cooked, which is unfortunate. You lose that beautiful, rich purple color. What I try to do with my purple beans is undercook them slightly so that they kind of become splotchy. They'll partly turn green but have a little bit of their purple remaining. I like to saute them really quickly in a pan with a little bit of olive oil and butter. I like to infuse some garlic into the butter and olive oil as it warms up. And then I just really quickly pan saute the beans until I like them to still be crisp. and that way you keep some of that purple color too. Sprinkle a little bit of salt. They're really delicious. That's my favorite way to cook fresh green beans, or I'm calling them green beans, fresh beans, because some of these are, of course, actually purple. Here, you can see I have a wall of tomatoes here, and we haven't harvested any tomatoes from this area yet, but you can see I do have one starting to turn. This is a Thorburns terracotta. This variety was actually recommended by many of you as having delicious flavor, so I'm excited to try that one. Several of you commented earlier in the season when I was planning out my tomato varieties about the Thorburns terracotta. I think the overall consensus I heard from many of you was that it had amazing flavor. The yield may not have been the best, and it was also really important to harvest it at just the right time for the best flavor. So if any of you have grown the Thorburns terracotta, I'd love to hear from you again. Any tips that you have? How ripe do you let it get? I know, as I said, I know many of you have commented before, but I would love to get more feedback on that and just your overall thoughts on it. So over here, this is the persimmon tomato. You can see these are small, not quite ready yet. And I've got a variety. This is the Lemon Boy Plus, which is a hybrid. I'm experimenting with growing a few hybrid tomatoes this year mixed in with my classic heirlooms. So we'll see how these do. As I said, I really prefer to grow heirlooms because I love that they're so unique. I find that they have an amazing flavor. They're really beautiful. The problem with heirlooms is that they don't always yield as well as hybrids do, and they're also, in general, not as disease resistant. So a lot of times my heirlooms won't yield all the way up to frost for me because they end up succumbing to disease. My hope with adding a couple hybrids into the mix was to extend the tomato growing season, hopefully all the way up till frost. So that's why I have some hybrids growing here, and I will let you know how those do as the season goes on. So here you can see one of my broccoli beds is covered, as mentioned before. I think I'm just going to leave all my brassica beds covered today for this tour. So I guess this won't necessarily be considered a full garden tour. The brassicas, there isn't really much to show because I've harvested the main heads of the broccoli. We're really just getting side shoots off of those broccolis now. They don't look that amazing, so I'm just going to keep them covered, and we'll move on to some more interesting things going on in the garden. Now back behind my crazy pumpkin, you can see I've got another wall of tomatoes there, which I feel like might be suffering a little bit from the pumpkin, but you can see we're still getting some ripe tomatoes, and I think that while it won't necessarily be ideal, I think that we'll still get a good yield from it. So here, this brassica bed, you can see, is packed with kale. I've got some cabbage that's starting to head up, and this is a small cabbage. This is early Jersey Wakefield. I do actually need to come out and harvest another batch of this kale for the freezer. My favorite way to preserve kale is to just harvest the leaves. I just wash them, I strip out the thick center rib, and then I stuff them into a freezer bag and stick them in the freezer. They freeze great. Now, obviously, you're going to be limited in how you use those when you take them out. But what I like to do is I just crumble them right into soups and things like that. I don't use them raw. I don't use them for kale chips, anything where they really need to be crispy, because some of the texture is going to be compromised. But if you're using them in an application like soup, which is one of the main ways that I like to use kale anyway, you can just crumble it right in and it works perfectly well. So as I said, I need to come out and harvest another batch of this and stick in my freezer. So here you can see my sauce tomato patch, which is a little sad. This is honestly, it's not a complete fail because you can see, I mean, there are quite a few tomatoes on here. It's just not what it could be. So I think one of the issues is completely my fault. You can see that I did not mulch this area. What happened was I mulched my main tomato areas and I ran out of my straw that I was using for mulch, and I just hadn't gotten around to getting more. And honestly, it had been so long that, at this point, I think I'm just going to let them go how they are for the rest of the season. They're starting to yield. They're starting to ripen a little bit. We'll see how they do. I know it won't be ideal. It is kind of ironic because I know I was talking about this being the lazy garden tour. One of my tricks to being able to garden a little more lazily is to use mulch. It's obviously a little bit more work initially to put the mulch in, but it saves you so much work as the season goes on that I think that really is a great lazy gardening tip. And, I didn't take my own advice here. This isn't mulched. So I'm going to say the lackluster performance of this is on me. Mulch is probably not the only issue, but I know it's a contributing factor. So over this way is my cherry tomato patch, which you can see this is mulched. These are performing much better. I actually came out yesterday and harvested quite a few cherry tomatoes. You can see there's some that are on the verge of ripening, but I don't have any others that are fully ripe yet. My son's birthday is tomorrow, and one of the little traditions that we do in our house is whoever's birthday it is gets to choose what's for dinner. And my son gets so excited about that and takes it really seriously. So he's been planning for months what he wanted to do for his birthday dinner. Since he has a summer birthday, he has lots of great choices from the garden. One of the things he really wanted to do was a caprese salad with cherry tomatoes. So, I harvest cherry tomatoes from the garden. I like to get a good variety. That's one reason why I like to grow so many different kinds. We get those little mini mozzarella balls. We, get some fresh basil from the garden, chop that up, toss it with a little bit of olive oil, salt, balsamic vinegar. It's really delicious. So I harvested a lot of these cherry tomatoes maybe a day or so before being ripe. And I'm going to let them finish ripening in the house, and they're going to get turned into delicious caprese salad for my son's birthday tomorrow. Now over here, you can see I have some really large zucchini plants. We've just started harvesting zucchinis. I can see in here, it looks like I've got another one just starting. I know throughout this garden, I don't know if you can really see from here, there's another one back there. I think I have 3 zucchinis, maybe more, that are working on developing right now. Behind the zucchinis, you can see I have my wall of tomatoes, and there's a few red ones there. That's Wisconsin 55. Wisconsin 55 is really quickly becoming one of my go-to tomato varieties. It yields really well. The tomatoes, while they don't have a really wow flavor, they have a really good, solid tomato flavor. I mean, far superior to anything you'd get at the grocery store. They're really good and delicious. It yields really well, and it yields really early. So I'm thinking that is definitely going on my go-to list. Last year was actually the first year I grew it. It wowed me last year. It's wowing me again this year. So thinking that's going to be a must grow. Now, most of these other tomato plants here have not produced ripe tomatoes yet, but they do have quite a few large tomatoes, so I'm really looking forward to harvesting those too. So here you can see my poppies. We have a couple small flowers, but for the most part, they're done blooming. I am letting these seeds fully ripen so that we can harvest these seeds both for baking and for sowing next year. The variety of poppy that I grew this year was called Lauren's Grape. They were beautiful and stunning. If you didn't see them, you should go watch my previous garden tour because they were glorious when they were in full bloom. And it is a bread seed type of poppy, which is the type where you can save the seeds and use them for baking. So I am definitely going to do that and take advantage of every little harvest I can get. So thank you so much for hanging out with me in the garden today. I really enjoyed sharing the growth of my garden with you. I know it's a little wild and a little crazy, but I think that's beautiful. I love wild, crazy gardens. So I'd love to hear what's going well in your garden, and if you want to share, I'd love to hear also what's not going so well. I hope that you're having a great day. I hope that your gardens are beautiful and abundant, and you are really enjoying this gardening season. I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.